It was a crisp Saturday afternoon when Oliver and I arrived at Amelia's home in Manchester. The front garden was neatly trimmed, and pastel balloons bobbed gently in the chilly breeze. The baby shower was in full swing. Laughter floated out from the open windows, mixing with the faint scent of scones and fresh flowers. I straightened the hem of my navy blue dress and tightened my grip on the gift bag. Even after 3 years of marriage, every gathering with Oliver's family felt like stepping onto a stage where I was being silently judged. Oliver, as always, slipped effortlessly into the crowd. He was greeted with cheerful hugs and familiar jokes. Meanwhile, I was met with polite smiles and half-hearted nods. Rebecca, his older sister, gave me a quick once-over and a tight-lipped smile before turning back to her conversation. Inside, the living room was adorned with pink and gold decorations. A table was overflowing with finger sandwiches, cakes, and pitchers of elderflower cordial. I found a quiet corner by the window and tried to blend into the wallpaper. Minutes later, Amelia herself spotted me. Her face lit up as she waddled over, one hand resting on her prominent bump. She was one of the few who treated me warmly, and I was grateful for her kindness. "Gemma, darling, you look lovely," she beamed. I smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "Congratulations, Amelia. You must be over the moon." Before we could say more, a chorus of laughter erupted behind us. Oliver's Aunt Margaret had arrived, dragging a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and sharp-tongued humor behind her. She clutched a glass of Prosecco and wasted no time gathering a small audience around her. Her eyes locked onto me almost immediately. I felt a prickle of unease as she approached. "So, Gemma dear," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "when will we be celebrating your baby shower, The room fell silent. Every head turned towards me. Oliver chuckled uncomfortably and rubbed the back of his neck. Rebecca snickered behind her hand. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. My heart pounded. I forced a tight smile. "Oh, we're just enjoying our time together for now," I said lightly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Enjoying it a bit too long, if you ask me," she quipped, sending a ripple of laughter through the room. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat, feeling smaller and smaller by the second. And that, I feared, was only the beginning of the evening. I escaped to the dining room, seeking a few moments of solitude. The clink of china and bursts of laughter faded slightly as I leaned against the cool marble countertop. I busied myself rearranging the plates of petit fours, anything to look occupied and invisible. Behind me, I caught the low murmur of voices drifting through the doorway. I froze. "I heard they've been trying for ages," said a voice I recognized as Rebecca's. "You know, it doesn't always happen for everyone." Another voice, softer but no less cutting, added, "Maybe it's for the best. Some people just aren't meant to be parents." The words sliced through me. I kept my head down, willing myself not to react. My fingers trembled slightly as I placed another cake on the tiered stand. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Oliver laughing with his cousins, oblivious to the sting of the conversations floating around me. I took a deep breath, forcing the rising tide of emotion back down where it belonged. This was not the time. Not here. But the walls of the house seemed to close in tighter with every passing minute. Every glance felt like it carried judgment. Every smile was tinged with pity. Amelia found me again just as I was debating whether to slip away unnoticed. "There you are," she chirped, linking her arm through mine. "Come on, it's time for the games." I pasted on a bright smile and allowed her to lead me back into the lion's den. The room buzzed with excitement as pink and gold envelopes were passed around. "First game," announced Amelia, her cheeks flushed with joy. "Guess the baby food." Laughter erupted as tiny jars were handed out. People dipped spoons into mysterious purees, grimacing and giggling. I played along, but my heart wasn't in it. When it was my turn, I hesitated. The jar in my hand smelled vaguely of overcooked peas. I dipped my spoon in and tasted it mechanically, forcing a laugh as the bitterness hit my tongue. "Peas," I guessed weakly. "Correct," someone cheered, but the sound felt hollow in my ears. I caught Margaret's smirk across the room and felt another pang twist in my chest. No matter how many games I played, or how wide my smile stretched, I would never quite belong. The worst, I knew deep down, was still yet to come. The sky outside had darkened, heavy clouds rolling in as if they mirrored the mood festering inside the house. I stood by the large bay window, watching as the first fat drops of rain splattered against the glass. The laughter behind me continued, but it felt thinner now, stretched too tight over something brittle. Margaret drifted closer, a flute of champagne in her hand. She smiled, but her eyes gleamed with something sharper than kindness. "You're looking a bit peaky, darling," she said sweetly. "Everything all right at home?" I bristled but forced a polite chuckle. "Just a bit tired, that's all." Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, it's not too late. There are clinics abroad that can help. Expensive, of course, but what price can you really put on a family?" The words hung in the air, foul and sticky. I barely managed a stiff nod before turning away, pretending to be fascinated by a particularly ugly vase on the windowsill. Lightning forked across the sky, bathing the room in a cold, blue light for a moment. A low rumble of thunder followed. As if sensing the shift, Amelia clapped her hands together. "All right, everyone. Time for the big reveal." Excitement buzzed through the guests like electricity. Little cards were passed around, asking for guesses. Boy or girl? Names? Due dates? Oliver appeared at my side, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. I clung to it like a lifeline, grateful for the tiny anchor in the rising storm. "We've decided," Amelia announced proudly, "to reveal it with a cake." She gestured dramatically to a large, ornate cake sitting in the center of the table. A single slice would reveal pink or blue inside. The crowd oohed and awed, gathering round. I hung back, my stomach twisting with something I couldn't name. I watched as Amelia and Thomas grinned at each other and drove the knife into the cake together. The knife cut smoothly. A thick wedge fell away, revealing a brilliant cloud of pink sponge beneath the white icing. The room exploded in cheers. "A girl," someone screamed. Amelia burst into tears, Thomas laughing as he gathered her into his arms. The family closed in, offering congratulations, gifts, hugs. I smiled, but it felt detached, like it belonged to someone else. Outside, the rain turned into a downpour, hammering against the windows. And inside, despite the warmth and the smiles, I had never felt more alone. The storm had no intention of easing. Rain hammered against the roof, relentless drumming that seeped into every corner of the house. The party carried on, but it felt as if the walls themselves were leaning closer, listening. I wandered through the crowd, exchanging empty pleasantries, my mind buzzing. It was then I noticed someone slipping away from the main hall. It was Margaret. Curiosity prickled at my spine. Without quite knowing why, I followed her. She moved swiftly through the corridors, champagne glass still clutched in one hand. She pushed open a narrow door, vanishing inside. I crept closer, heart pounding, and peered through the crack. It was a study, dimly lit, filled with dark wood and heavy books. Margaret wasn't alone. Thomas was there too. My breath caught in my throat. They stood close. Too close. Margaret was speaking in a low, urgent tone, her fingers brushing Thomas's sleeve. He didn't pull away. I strained to hear, but caught only fragments. "Won't wait forever, Thomas. She's not the one you wanted." A sick feeling unfurled in my stomach. Suddenly, Thomas turned sharply towards the door. I ducked back, pressing myself against the cold wall, heart hammering. Footsteps. Laughter. Margaret and Thomas reemerged, masks of polite indifference firmly in place. I stood frozen, watching them drift back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Oliver found me minutes later, concern flickering across his face. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, the taste of bile rising in my throat. "Just too much champagne," I lied. But in my gut, a storm raged fiercer than anything outside. Something was rotten here. Something no slice of pink cake could cover up. and I had just scratched the surface. The next morning brought a gray, sullen light. Ravenscroft House looked less like a manor and more like a crumbling fortress, battered by rain and secrets. Breakfast was a stiff affair. Hardly anyone spoke. Margaret smiled a little too brightly. Thomas barely touched his food. Lady Ravenscroft surveyed us all with the sharpness of a hawk. After a few unbearable minutes, I excused myself, claiming a headache. Oliver shot me a concerned look, but I hurried away before he could ask questions. I needed answers, and I had a feeling the house itself might be willing to give them. The library was deserted. Rows upon rows of dusty books loomed around me. I wandered aimlessly at first, trailing my fingers along spines of forgotten novels, until something caught my eye. A book slightly askew. Curious, I pulled it. With a faint click, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a hidden passageway, narrow and dark. I hesitated only a second before slipping inside. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The passage twisted and turned, leading deeper into the heart of the house. Every step I took felt like trespassing into a realm meant to stay hidden. Faint voices drifted towards me. I froze. "She's close to finding out," a man's voice said. "Then we must act," a woman replied, cold and firm. I pressed myself against the wall, heart thudding wildly. It was Margaret and another man, someone I didn't recognize. Their words chilled me. "Tonight, during the bonfire," the woman continued. "An accident. It must look like an accident." My stomach twisted. They were planning something. And whoever she was, I had the sinking feeling it was me. Before I could think, my foot brushed against a loose stone. It clattered to the ground, loud as a gunshot. The voices stopped. Silence. Then hurried footsteps, coming straight towards me. I turned and fled back the way I had come, breath burning in my lungs, the walls closing in around me. I stumbled out of the passage, slamming the hidden door shut just as someone reached the other side. I leaned against the bookshelf, trying to steady my breathing as the library door creaked open. It was Oliver. "There you are," he said, smiling. "I've been looking everywhere." I forced a smile back, even as terror clawed at my insides. Because now I knew the truth. Someone here wanted me dead. The evening air was sharp and full of promise as the staff and guests gathered outside Ravenscroft House for the traditional bonfire celebration. Towering flames licked at the darkening sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the grounds. Music played faintly from an old gramophone. Laughter and chatter masked the underlying tension I could feel crackling in the air like static. Oliver found me by the drinks table, offering a cup of mulled wine. I accepted it, if only to stop my hands from trembling. I hadn't told him what I had overheard in the hidden passage. Not yet. I needed proof. Margaret floated through the crowd like a queen, her smiles warm and practiced. Thomas stuck close to her side, his face unusually pale. Lady Ravenscroft stood apart, surveying the bonfire with an expression I could not read. As the fire roared higher, Margaret raised her glass. "To the enduring spirit of Ravenscroft," she proclaimed. The crowd cheered, but I could barely hear them. My eyes were locked on a figure near the edge of the gathering. A man, tall, with dark hair, the same voice I'd heard in the secret passageway. He caught me looking and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Suddenly, Margaret was at my elbow. "Come, dear," she said sweetly. "Let's get closer to the fire. It's a tradition to make a wish." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But I smiled and followed, heart pounding. The firelight flickered over Margaret's face, casting deep shadows. As we stepped closer to the bonfire, I noticed something strange. At the base of the huge pyre, near where we were heading, the ground looked uneven, as if it had been recently disturbed. Margaret's hand tightened on my arm. I stumbled, pretending to adjust my shoe, forcing her to loosen her grip. Just then, the ground under the pyre shifted, a subtle but deliberate movement. It was a trap. I straightened, smiling as if nothing were wrong, and took a careful step back, away from the pyre. Margaret's smile froze. Oliver appeared at my side. "There you are," he said cheerfully, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. We were just about to start the sparklers. I clung to him like a lifeline, feeling Margaret's furious gaze burn into my back. We moved back into the crowd. Safely. But only for now. Because tonight, someone had tried to kill me. And I needed to find out why before they succeeded. The bonfire festivities dragged on, but my mind wasn't with the music or laughter. Every smile around me now seemed suspicious, every cheer a possible disguise for something darker. I needed answers. Late that night, once the house had gone quiet and the guests retired to their rooms, I crept from my chamber. The corridors of Ravenscroft House were cold and dimly lit, the only sounds the creak of ancient wood and the whisper of the wind against the windows. I headed towards the study. Earlier that evening, before the bonfire, I had seen Thomas slip inside with a bundle of papers clutched to his chest. He looked terrified, glancing over his shoulder before shutting the door behind him. Now, the study door was ajar. I pushed it open silently. Inside, the fireplace smoldered with dying embers. Shadows danced across the walls. I slipped inside, my eyes scanning the room. Papers were strewn across the desk in a messy heap, as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. Among the scattered documents, one stood out, an old ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it. Inside were lists of names, dates, and amounts of money. Large sums, exchanged for services rendered. Next to many of the names, a red cross had been hastily drawn. My heart pounded. These were payoffs. Hush money. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, piecing it together. Someone had been buying silence for years at Ravenscroft House. But about what? A sound at the door made me freeze. Footsteps. Quickly, I slid the ledger under my coat and slipped behind the heavy velvet curtains. Through a thin gap, I watched as Thomas entered the study, his face pale and sweat beading his forehead. Behind him, Margaret. Her expression was no longer warm and maternal. It was hard, ruthless. "You were supposed to destroy the book," she hissed. Thomas stammered, backing away. "I couldn't. I thought." "You thought wrong," she said coldly. Before I could react, Margaret drew a small pistol from the folds of her coat. Thomas raised his hands in a desperate plea. "I swear I didn't say anything," he cried. "No one knows." Margaret's voice was ice. "They soon will if you stay alive." There was a sharp crack. Thomas crumpled to the floor without a sound. I pressed a hand to my mouth to stop a scream escaping. Margaret stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, then tucked the pistol away, adjusted her coat, and calmly left the study. I stayed frozen behind the curtains, my mind racing. Thomas was dead. I was now holding the evidence Margaret had killed to protect. And if she found out, I would be next. I stayed hidden behind the curtain until the study had been silent for what felt like hours. When I finally slipped out, I avoided looking at Thomas's still body. My hands shook as I clutched the hidden ledger to my chest and crept out into the darkened hallway. The old floorboards groaned under my weight. Every sound felt magnified in the silence. I had to get to Henry. He had to see this. As I made my way towards the guest rooms, a sudden voice stopped me cold. "Out late, aren't we?" It was Gregory. He stood half in shadow, a glass of brandy swinging lazily from his hand, his eyes gleaming. I tried to sound casual. "Couldn't sleep," I said, forcing a smile. Gregory's gaze dropped to the bulge beneath my coat. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he just smirked. "Best get back to bed." Lots of excitement tonight. I nodded quickly and moved on, heart hammering. The house suddenly seemed endless, its corridors twisting into unfamiliar shapes. It was as if Ravenscroft itself was alive, conspiring to trap me. When I reached Henry's door, I knocked softly. No answer. I tried the handle. It turned easily. Inside, the room was dark, the bed unmade but empty. A cold draft blew through an open window. Curtains fluttered like ghostly hands. Henry was gone. Panic rose in my throat. Where could he have gone at this hour? I turned back into the hallway, and there, at the far end, I saw a flicker of movement. A figure. Familiar. Henry? Without thinking, I ran after it. My footsteps echoed, but the figure stayed ahead, always just out of reach. I called out in a whisper, but they didn't turn around. Through twisting corridors and down narrow staircases, I followed, deeper into Ravenscroft's forgotten wings. At last, the figure slipped through a heavy oak door. I reached it moments later. It wasn't locked. Beyond was a narrow staircase spiraling downwards into darkness. I hesitated only a moment, then plunged after them. The air grew colder with each step. And then, finally, the staircase opened into a vast, hidden cellar lit only by the flicker of dying torches. In the center of the room stood Henry, bound to a chair. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Around him, cloaked figures circled, chanting in low, guttural tones that made my skin crawl. At the head of them stood Margaret. Her eyes locked onto mine across the chamber. "You shouldn't have come here," she said. Her voice echoed off the stone walls like a death sentence. The chilling words from Margaret froze me in place. The cloaked figures tightened their circle around Henry, their chants rising in intensity. I clenched the ledger tighter, knowing it was the only weapon I had. "You don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "I know everything. About the trust fund. About Thomas." A ripple passed through the circle. Some of the cloaked figures hesitated. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You know nothing," she spat. Slowly, she moved closer, her face emerging from beneath the heavy hood. No one was supposed to uncover this. Ravenscroft's legacy must be preserved, no matter the cost. Henry struggled against his bonds, his muffled protests barely audible. I took a careful step forward. "If you hurt him, if you hurt anyone else, the truth will still come out." Margaret let out a cold, humorless laugh. "There is no truth outside these walls." At her signal, two of the figures stepped forward, holding strange, old-fashioned daggers. The situation was spinning out of control. Desperately, I scanned the room. High above, near the ceiling, there were iron beams and old pulley systems, remnants of Ravenscroft's forgotten history. An idea sparked. I needed a distraction. Quickly, I flung the ledger across the room. It slammed into a dusty crate, sending a loud crash echoing around the chamber. The cloaked figures jerked their heads towards the noise, momentarily distracted. Without thinking, I grabbed a loose brick from the wall and hurled it at the nearest torch. The flames sputtered wildly and leapt to a hanging tapestry, which instantly caught fire. Chaos exploded. The figures scattered, trying to put out the flames. I sprinted across the floor to Henry, yanking at the ropes that bound him. "Hold still," I hissed. Henry grunted in pain but stayed still enough for me to untie him. The smoke grew thick, the fire spreading fast along the ancient wood beams. We stumbled to our feet just as Margaret screeched in fury. "Stop them!" But the fire was out of control now, and the figures were more concerned with saving themselves than stopping us. I grabbed Henry's arm, and we bolted up the narrow staircase, coughing and choking as we climbed. Behind us, Ravenscroft's secrets burned. We burst through the heavy oak doors of Ravenscroft Hall into the cold night air. The flames were already licking up the side of the old mansion, casting eerie shadows across the courtyard. Henry staggered beside me, coughing violently. "We have to get to the car," I said urgently. The gravel crunched under our feet as we sprinted towards the parking lot. Behind us, the hall groaned and cracked, parts of the roof collapsing under the fury of the fire. But just as we reached the car, a dark figure emerged from the smoke. It was Margaret. Her cloak was gone, revealing a sharp, furious face twisted in rage. In her hand, she held a pistol, trembling but deadly. "You don't get to leave," she hissed. Henry instinctively stepped in front of me. Margaret advanced, her finger tightening on the trigger. "All of Ravenscroft belongs to us," she said, her voice trembling. "4 generations, we protected it. And you, meddling children, ruined everything." I raised my hand slowly. "You can still walk away," I said softly. "No one else is to get hurt." For a moment, Margaret's eyes flickered with uncertainty. And in that moment, Henry moved. He lunged at her with all the strength he could muster. The gun fired, the sound deafening in the open air. I gasped. Henry and Margaret struggled, the pistol falling to the ground. I kicked it away as fast as I could. Margaret screamed and clawed at Henry, but he pushed her back. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Someone must have seen the fire and called for help. Margaret, realizing her end was near, crumpled to her knees, sobbing in defeat. I rushed to Henry's side. He was bleeding from a scratch across his arm, but otherwise he was alive. The authorities arrived moments later, arresting Margaret and the remaining cult members who had fled the fire only to be captured outside. As the sun began to rise behind the blackened ruins of Ravenscroft Hall, I felt a strange peace settle over me. The secrets of Ravenscroft were finally exposed, and Henry and I, scarred but alive, had survived them.